Well, inequality is really a misconception, and so are the policies for dealing with it. This idea of being unequal, it's just difference, and it's a mistake to assume that men and women want to do things in the same way.
But if you're trying to push forward a feminist agenda now, what would you counsel people who want more equality to do?
Well,
what should the next stage be? Sorry,
I just want to clarify something. I do not think men and women want to do it in the same way.
Good, okay.
Men parent, in my experience, quite differently often than women do, and women definitely work differently than men do. So I'm not suggesting they're going to do it the same way. I'm suggesting, and actually I think it'd be better for raising children if they had the different models of how you raise children. We think we know how to raise children because women have always raised children, but men do. Look at all the gay men that are raising children and doing it very well. But so I don't think they'll do it the same way. That's not what I'm saying.
Okay. Men and women do want to do things in different ways. Good. Yeah. I'm glad we've got to that. So well, that's very important. And so we're not trying to get a one-size-fits-all solution to the workplace and to the family. Okay. Then we might look at what females prefer when they have the chance to choose. And that's, I think, what you were talking about with the Nordic example, that in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and so on, women have very, very good support for looking after the children, etc., etc. The bottom line is they actually don't want to go back to work full-time in the way that women do in other countries because they have to. In the States, they have to go back to work full-time. In the Nordic countries, they choose not to, and they are really happier that way. That's a choice.
Thank you, Helena. Can I just, Amanda, what should feminism do next, very briefly?
Well, very briefly, I side with Gloria Steinem, who said, you have to know the truth even if it pisses you off. So what is the truth here? Well, the truth is that today what I think we're talking about are that women need to have three things to have equality. They need to have agency, autonomy, and authority. That means they need to have the ability to make their own decisions, the capability to carry them out, and the control to be able to stick to them. The good news is that we've made enough progress in the 21st century for that to be the case. But the bad news is that everything that we have achieved can be taken away. And history shows that again and again. In the 7th century China, women were the most liberated in the world. They had a female prime minister, a female empress, and they had a whole raft of legal protections. Wow. 600 years later, China is a divided country. Women have had every single protection, every single law that gave them access to the public space taken away, and foot binding, which has crippled them for life, has been introduced. Today, we are facing that same kind of challenge, and the countries that do not protect women's rights are poorer, more unstable, more violent, and more culturally stagnant than the countries that do. And that is where the future of feminism lies.
Wow. Afua, a quick recommendation for what you do next with feminism.
A couple of things I'd like to see. You all already know my views about race. But I think in terms of history, we've heard a lot about history, which I think is crucial. I would love to see the feminist movement not just acknowledge that black women are an integral part of feminism now, but also acknowledge more of the history. For example, we had the suffragette film. It was so disappointing that that film neither acknowledged the role that black people played in the women's equality movement in that period, and also some of the allegiances that were made between the suffragette movement and racist segregationists, especially in America. I'm not trying to cast blame. I think we need an honest appraisal of our history so that we can move forward, and that's not happening at the moment. Another thing I would like to see, since I'm hitting race, I might as well hit class. I would like to see feminism do more to acknowledge that not all women are aspiring to be the next CEO of Pepsi, potentially because they're not in the corporate world, and a lot of feminist books, to me, speak very much to a specific context that even I don't relate to, let alone women who aren't in as privileged a position as me. And I think that we still tend to see poor women as other and not part of this debate. As we heard earlier, I'm about to go and report, we were all having a lively discussion about this in the green room earlier, on the full face veil and whether it should be banned in schools. And I think that without taking a side on that particularly thorny debate right now at the end, I think that the question of what Muslim women in deprived communities do and the way it's dealt with is often not acknowledging their agency, and I think that they should be treated fairly as women in this debate. So I would like to see an inclusiveness, not just on race, but also on class. And I think that that is what we need to strengthen the feminist movement, because as long as too many women feel excluded or intimidated, this just remains an elite conversation, and I think that it's time for it to become much more than that.
Daniel, I just want to discriminate against you by asking you to talk just for 30 seconds so we can get to some questions. But I think you can live with it.
I can live with it. So one really specific thing I'm quite interested in at the moment, which makes me really crazy. A neighbour upstairs had a baby, is going back to her big American law firm in London, has been told the classic thing that if she comes back, she can only do the 60-hour weeks or nothing. I just think, I'm not allowed to swear, am I? But that is totally ridiculous. That's fucking ridiculous. The idea that a big American firm can't find, I say American, a big law firm cannot find a mechanism by which somebody, a woman or man, can come back and work, roughly speaking, the hours she wants to work, with or without the notice that she does, defies belief with the organizational patterns we have, with the technology we have. And the thing which I really don't understand about it, and perhaps you can explain to me afterwards, folks, would it not be advantageous for a law firm to say, we're the ones who cracked that problem, and you can tell us when you come back from whatever you've been doing, how many hours you want to work, for whatever reason, and we'll fix that for you. It seems to me extraordinary that that isn't offered. Anyway, could try to fix that one? That would be good.
I think Anne-Marie can do that.
There are law firms that have done that, but they do different kind of work from the other law firms. And if women do want to work in those ways, they choose the firms that do that sort of work. It's as simple as that.
No, big law is actually falling apart because of that. As a law professor, I don't believe it.
I'd love to take some questions. We're going to take them 3 at a time. Can you please keep them short but fascinating? Could we have the lady there and this gentleman here, and I can't see any, lady in the middle in the black sleeve. Please just say your name quickly if you would as well.
My name's Nadia and I study gender at LSE at a master level, and I really thought this was an amazing conversation. But one of the things that I wanted to note was, Helena, in terms of talking about men and women being different, I want to say, of course, they're different because they're conditioned to be as such, because I have to act differently to a man being friendly to me, as I would if a woman was being friendly to me, because of the conditioning that I'm under. I have to identify as a woman because in response to sexism, not because that dichotomy. Basically, what I'm trying to emphasize is the problem of dichotomy that you've been speaking of and reinforcing. And I think what is important to focus on intersectionality, which is what Afua you've been doing tonight, and I think what you've said has smashed it basically. Focusing more on race, trans experience, that's exactly what we must do, because it is this dichotomy that is provoking the inequality that we keep reinforcing.
Nadia, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
This gentleman.
Hi. I was going to ask actually about intersectionality and class, but Afua got there right at the end and saved me from having to do that. Instead, I'd like to ask how the panel responds to campaigns such as we need to get a female Secretary General of the UN, or that if we had more women in the Situation Room, there'd be less wars, and these things that seem to be overtly feminist, but actually accentuate the difference between men and women and play on assumptions. And I wondered how the panel would respond to things like that. Thanks.
Thank you. And lastly, lady at the back. Yeah, that's you. Yes, you.
Fantastic. My question's actually related
Sorry, your
to
name?
Julia, in relation to Daniel's last comment. When you speak about hours, I think you've actually hit the jackpot, because in the UK, and definitely my friends in America would say that more hours equals more productivity. But what about if we switched it the other way and said, actually, we need this done, and I don't really mind if it takes less time? I think there'd be a lot more room for women to actually say we could do that and work out when they want to do it. And I just wondered what your view was that as a whole.
I'd like to go straight to Anne-Marie. Thank you, they're great questions, because I know she's very hot on hours, and also, what about the campaigns to get women into senior roles, and then we'll take you on the other one.
I couldn't agree with you more on hours. Essentially, all the research that I've read on productivity, and actually Henry Ford was the original one who said after 8 hours, productivity falls, and we have an 8-hour workday. Sweden's introducing a 6-hour workday. When I see somebody who stays till 10 o'clock routinely after hours, I say, I think you have a problem with time management. Right? And I think you're not being very efficient, because I know other people can get the same amount of work done and be out of the office when they need to do whatever else they want. So this is a culture. It's a culture of time macho and it is a competitive thing. It's a very competitive thing that says I work better because I work longer, when everything we know about productivity and about rest and about recharging and exposing yourself to things, not the same thing all the time, says actually working after a point, working more is actually producing less. So that point, on this very interesting question of, do I believe that a woman Secretary of the General of the United Nations would be more Pacific? No. Generally, the first woman in any of these jobs is more male than the men, because that's what she's got to do to get there and to prove it. So I wouldn't say that. I'd say we need a woman, and preferably a woman of color and many different people, because of diversity of perspective. But I would also say that there's good social science evidence that says once you hit a critical mass of women in any group, not only do women feel free to express what they really want to say and not conform to what men they think they should say, but men's behavior changes too. Because men feel like it's okay to say what they want to say that may not conform to very traditional definitions of masculinity.
Thank you. Helena, quick response to Nadia saying she feels socially conditioned to respond in a particular way.
Over evolutionary time, there have been very different costs and benefits to males and females of certain kinds of behavior. For example, it did no damage to males to have lots and lots of sex with lots of different women. But for women, it would have been a huge disadvantage to have sex with any man.
Nadia, sorry, you can talk to Helena afterwards. But
I'm just giving you an example, it's a very extreme example, of the difference of costs and benefits in different behaviors to men and women. And I think what you're picking up on are innate differences, probably between men and women, in the costs and benefits of those behaviors over our evolutionary past. And it's absolutely ridiculous to assume that all behaviors were neutral for both sexes. That is not so in any sexually reproducing species whatsoever for the last 800 million years. And it's not suddenly true of ours.
Can we take 3 more questions, please? Gentleman here. A lady right at the back on the, of that far block. She had her hand up with the long hair and the black top. And a lady here at the end of the row. Would you, whoever gets a mic first, please.
Sorry, no 2 mics. Kate Grusing. Given so many of the protagonists that have come up in this discussion are American women, be they Gloria Steinem or Anne-Marie Slaughter or Sheryl Sandberg, I'm fascinated, and yes, this is a North American accent, for Anne-Marie's perspective on where is America ahead of the UK, and what could we learn to help our British women be more aggressive and competitive?
Without being judged to be either.
Yeah.
Or it is ahead.
Whoever's got the mic next.
Hi, my name's Emily. I just have a quick question in terms of what's next. I work with brands a lot. I work for a brand consultancy. And I'm just interested in the context of huge companies like Unilever, PepsiCo, who are really working on their social purpose and social missions. What do you think is the next step for brands? How can they help feminism be more inclusive? All the things we've been saying this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Dan Reinstein. Obviously, the issue that you all do agree with is equality, and I think Ms. Hirsch put it best in terms of equality of opportunity. And then nature might determine the final pathway. You know, when I walked in here, the first thing I noticed was that 97% of the audience is women. And I just wonder what you think, whether one of the things which is next for feminism is to completely rebrand it and call it equalism, not feminism, because many guys, especially younger guys, don't want to be called feminine. And somehow, I think there's a branding issue with that, in that it feminizes men to think that they're going to be feminists. And I wonder what you think about that. Marketing is everything.
Thanks, Dan. Maybe you've answered Emily's question about branding. Anne-Marie, I feel this is very much your territory.
Yes. Just on the first question, you know, Britain is ahead of the United States in many, many ways. Let's just start with the fact the United States does not have mandatory maternity leave, right? We and Papua New Guinea. Let me just say that again. We and Papua New Guinea are the only two countries in the entire world out of 194 nations that do not think that when a woman has a child, she should actually have some time to recover from the birth and feed the child. So Britain's way ahead. But the United States is ahead in terms of the number of women at the top. Now, part of that, actually, Helena said, you know, when you have to go back to work so fast, you stay in. And there are more women at the top, at the very top, and the US and Sweden are tied for 22% women in senior management. But the Nordic countries do not have free choice by a long shot. My article was as picked up in the Nordic countries as anywhere else, and they still think they've got a long way to go. I don't think that we want to convince British women to be more aggressive and competitive. I think actually the way Britain is tackling this is to say, look, you should be able to work part-time and still be on leadership track, right? You should be, that you make room for ways in which women and men can care for their children, and then don't waste that talent, and then you'll have women in the pool. So I think the U.S. is doing better in some ways, but I'm not sure the lesson is to be more aggressive. And on the rebranding, you just stole my closing statement, so I think I'm going to ask you to wait.
Okay. Amanda, you wanted to come in on that?
Well, just going to the point about hours, which leads us to the next thing, which is childcare. And there is never going to be gender equality in the workplace until women no longer have to pay the work tax, known as paying for childcare, out of your post-tax income. That is one of the single biggest impediments to all women who have children, and I have 5 children, so I know whereof I am talking.
Did anyone else want to respond to that? Equalism.
Well, I was just going to say about the child. My own assumption in households where men earn more than women, it's always seemed to me more natural that you should take the childcare cost from the bigger salary, not the smaller one. And once you've done that,
it's amazing how unnatural some relationships are.
Curious, isn't it? I did want to say, in terms of role models and the Secretary General of the United Nations, and one of the things. So I take my kids to school every morning, and if I'm not out doing fabulous things like this, I'm back by 6 and bath them. And I make sure I tell that to all of the young people and people I speak to, because I think it's really important that people assert that it's possible impossible to be the director of what will be London's most exciting engagement space when it opens next year. So that's going to without sacrificing family life for yourself. And I also think that we have to find ways in which women can take that role and assert their ability to do it too. It doesn't seem to me that it's an either-or. We have to have success models. The only thing as a neurobiologist I would say is that the categories that we're talking about and the plasticity that gives rise to them is different at different ages. So I am quite protective, it seems to me. I think we should be quite protective of the environment which younger people, certainly up to the age of 7, 8, 9, when a lot of these categories are formed, are exposed to. And again, for me, the solution in Britain, and I will say this over America, is CBeebies, right? I mean, the idea that there is a television station which has kind of thought a lot of this shit through seems like a really good idea. So on race and on gender, on the way they're portrayed, I have confidence that my kids can watch that up to a certain age and they will be given exposure to stuff like that. And again, as a neuroscientist, I'm pleased with that because they can do kind of what they like after the age of 9 in these terms, but these categories are formed early. So I do think we have to be quite careful about the categories to which our very young are exposed to, and their tokenism and equality or equity in that sense seems to me quite a good idea as a prescribed notion.
And I should say Teletubbies was gender fluid.
Yes, it was.
At least 7 different sexes represented there.
They're ahead of the transgender issue.
Yeah, right.
I'm going to have to ask the panel now to just tell us each in a minute or so, which is exactly the question that Dan was raising really, how do you get all kinds of people on board with this agenda? The people in this room are probably already sold on it, but how do you persuade the women who think that feminism has nothing to do with them, which is 93% of the population from what we know, 93% of the female population, and all the men who think that feminism is something which some weird women want to engage in, that actually this is in their interests? And I'm going to start off with asking Helena to give her summary about how we convince people.
Well, feminism began by opposing an injustice, women being denied choice solely because they were women. But this really admirable quest became derailed by an obdurate refusal to acknowledge that there are real sex differences. The good news is that a feminism informed by the Darwinian science of human nature, both male and female, reveals a very much more promising world. I'll just give you 2 examples. First, what constitutes success? Men and women have different life priorities. So why should male priorities, the pursuit to the top for money and power and fame, typically male priorities, why should they be the sole yardstick? Science illuminates why there are multiple paths to fulfillment, including the broader priorities that women in particular value. Second, what constitutes equality and fairness? Equality is not sameness. We shouldn't expect male and female choices to be identical. We shouldn't say it's wrong if they're not. Differential interests lead to differential trade-offs, and so to differential outcomes. These differences are not evidence of discrimination or lack of meritocracy. Fairness involves not denying difference, but understanding the consequences of them. So it's not sex differences, but sexism that should be challenged, and not science, but injustice that should be opposed. Helena. And just as a last point, science doesn't dictate goals, it doesn't. But it can help us to achieve our goals, it must. Because if we want to change the world, we first need to understand it. We don't try to build planes, but refuse to understand aerodynamics. So how can feminism forge a fairer world if it lacks a proper understanding of how the sexes differ?
Helena, thank you. We're going to have Afua next.
A big issue, I think, in why feminism affects everybody is mediocrity. There are a lot of mediocre men in senior positions, and I think it was Warren Buffett who said that I got off really lightly because I only had to compete with half of the pool of people who I could have been up against in my career. And I didn't respond to the questions, but in response to the great question about whether affirmative action is kind of reinforcing essentialist notions, the reason it's important to have women in the boardroom or in the control room is because if you are competing genuinely with the entire pool of talented people, you just get fewer mediocre people in senior positions. And that is to the benefit of everyone in society, as far as I'm concerned. I think that feminism, it does have an image problem, but I don't think it's just a question of changing the name. I think we need to look at the root causes, as I've said, why people feel intimidated or alienated by feminism. And part of that, as I said earlier, I think is being more honest about the history of feminism and being more inclusive about the future. I think a reason that men are to benefit from feminism is because it's simple progress. When we're talking about hours, the lack of productivity at work, the culture that we have, I think, everywhere in the world, where you want to be in before your boss and leave after him, usually him, which I see all the time. It kind of destroys my soul to see young people spending their lives doing something for the sake of being seen at the expense of their productivity and their dreams. I think it's a damaging practice, and I think that women are the ones at the moment who are forcing that to change, and I think everybody stands to benefit from that. And finally, just in response to the question about what can brands do to help feminism, stop using women's bodies to sell everything. Period. That's what I want to say.
Daniel.
I'm not saying that feminist problems or the problems that feminists focus on are the canary in the coal mine, but it seems to me increasingly that the issues where feminism is alarmed, I think of perhaps women in tech particularly, give clues to situations which are inefficient and unjust and should be changed. So the reason we should care about feminism is because it's quite an efficient way of detecting suboptimal human behavior. The tech industry is struggling, it feels to me, to embrace what is human. Seriously, they're selling us solutions to problems that most of us don't have, like how to do sociability without eye contact. And part of that, which is essentially what we've been sold. And that's taking place in a situation which has amongst the most horrifying figures in terms of women in the workplace and their treatment. So I think feminism is something that should concern us all because it shines a light on things we could do better. And to improve ourselves as humans, we should focus on those areas.
Thank you. Amanda, how do we sell it to everyone?
Well, I think that is a key question, and it's one I want to address, which is, what's in it for the men? And Lenin said, he said, the success of every revolution depends on the participation of women. And he's absolutely right. If you look at all revolutions going back to the French Revolution, it's when women joined the vanguard that the old order collapsed and a new order came in. But those very women who fought for change were always betrayed by the male leaders of that revolution. Always. Until you had a woman-led revolution in the 20th century. And why is that? That's because, on the whole, male revolutions, male-led ones, are about changing the power structure from one power level to the other power level. It's about oppositions, and that's it. Whereas when women fight for a revolution, they want to dismantle that power structure in order to bring in egalitarianism. And that's why feminism is good for men as well as women, because it brings in genuine equality.
Gosh. How are you going to change the world, Anne-Marie?
So I'm going to leave you with a few very simple prescriptions in terms of what we can do. So we can stop talking about mothers and start talking about parents. Every time you want to say mother, stop. Say parents and children, parents and family. Stop talking about daughters and start talking about caregivers, or in Britain, carers. Carers for parents, whether they're sons or daughters. Stop talking about fathers and start talking about earners or providers. both men and women. Start assuming that everybody, men and women, want some combination of the ability to invest in themselves and to invest in others. Everyone. And that all workers, all employees, will have caregiving responsibilities at some point in their lives, and a competitive, effective workplace, efficient, productive, will make room for that kind of care. And start assuming that investing in others is every bit as important and rewarding and valuable as investing in ourselves. And finally, I don't think I would call it equalism. I think egalitarianism is better, but maybe isms are not the way to go. What we are looking for is a world in which we don't assume everyone is the same, absolutely not, but a world in which our assumptions about who someone is and what they want and what they can achieve and what their potential is not tied to their sex or their gender or their sexual orientation any more than it is tied to the shape of their features or the color of their skin.